Okay, good evening, ladies. We would like to welcome Dr. Ali AlManna today with us in this, inshallah, enlightening and very interesting and enriching webinar. Dr. Ali AlManna is a series editor of Routledge Studies in Arabic Translation, London and New York. He obtained his PhD in Translation Studies from the University of Durham, UK, and his MA in Translation Studies from Westminster University, UK also. Currently, Dr. AlManna, he's an associate professor of translation studies at Al Hamad bin Khalifa University, College of Humanities and Social Sciences, where he teaches and supervises MA and PhD students. In addition to many articles published in peer-reviewed journals, he's an author, an editor, and also a translator of several publications. Among his recent publications are the Routledge Course in Translation Annotation, 2016, Semantics for Translation Students, 2016, The Nuts and Bolts of Arabic English Translation, 2018, Arabic English Translator as a Photographer, 2019, Reframing Realities Through Translation, 2020, and the Translation as a Set of Frames, 2021. Also among Dr. Ali's forthcoming books, Translation Politicized and Politics, translated with Professor Julian Hauser, Linguistics for Translators with Professor Julian Hauser again, and Legal Translation Between English and Arabic. So we would like to welcome Dr. Ali with us this evening. And please, I call upon him to start his talk in this webinar. The title is Translation as a Complex Activity. I would like to note, please, to the attendees that we will be sharing a survey link for you to fill up in halftime the session, inshallah. Thank you, and please enjoy and welcome with us Dr. Ali AlManna.
Thank you.
You're most welcome, Dr. Ali.
The organizers and also attendees for making this possible. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity to be with you today to talk about translation as a complex activity. Actually, I will start my own presentation with an idea, saying that the text that you receive for the purpose of translation is seen as a narrative, as a story, as a product. And that narrative or that story or that product is made up of several events, depending on the length and complexity of that product or that narrative. And each event is made up of several processes, again, depending on the length and complexity of the event. And each process, to borrow the idea from functional linguistics, to borrow the idea from Holiday, each process is made up of three main components, namely participant, typically expressed by noun phrases, action, typically expressed by verbs, and sometimes, not always, circumstances, typically expressed by adverbs, such as an adverb of time, an adverb of place, an adverb of manner, and so on and so forth. And each component, this is the most important thing, each component has certain characteristics and categories that should be reflected in the target text. However, it is worth noting that a narrative cannot be reduced to its elements by adopting a reductionist methodology or view. This is because the whole is more than just the sum of the parts, but rather the interaction among those parts should be given full consideration, should be given a front seat. And the interaction of parts in a complex system, such as translation, because today we look at translation as a complex activity. The interaction of those parts in a complex system can only be understood in a holistic way. And this is one of the characteristics of complexity thinking, also known as complexity theory, which is non-linearity. So the whole idea here is based on complexity thinking or complexity theory. So the question that might be raised here, what is complexity theory or what is complexity thinking? Actually, complexity thinking, I've already mentioned that, also known as complexity theory, is usually described as a revolutionary break from reductionism, al-ikhtizal. According to this theory, according to the complexity theory, the world, the whole world, is seen in terms of instability, عدم الاستقرار, and fluctuations, thus challenging notions such as disjunction, التفكيك, abstraction, التجريد, and reduction, الاختزال, that together form what is called reductionism, according to Moran, 2008. To understand complexity thinking or complexity theory, one needs to understand reductionism. So what is meant by reductionism? Actually, reductionism, according to Moran, one of the fathers of complexity theory, reductionism is an approach which is wrongly associated with the only way to do good science. It refers, I'm talking about reductionism, it refers to the search for simple units. It refers to the search for elementary units. It refers to the decomposition of a system into its elements. So let me use the same idea when I said, just to remind you, I said the text that you receive for the purpose of translation is seen as a narrative, and each narrative is made up of several events, and each event is made up of several processes, and so on and so forth. So here, as can be observed, each narrative has certain elements which are unique to that narrative. Therefore, changing one of those elements by accident or on purpose might affect the whole narrative, the whole product, the whole story. This indicates that a narrative cannot be understood without relying on its components. And this is the fourth feature of narrativity, which is called, in this project that I've been working on with some colleagues, we call it dependency, meaning that the interpretation of one element, the interpretation of one event relies on the interpretation of other events, whether inside the same story or outside the story, by activating our personal knowledge, by activating our experiences in life. And the same holds true for the elements. They cannot be understood without taking into consideration the interaction. We have already mentioned that. So the interaction among those elements should be given full consideration. This is the first characteristic of complexity thinking, which is emergence, الظهور أو البزوغ. Emergence as a characteristic of a complex system cannot be found or reduced to the properties of the parts which constitute the characteristic of that component. I'll repeat, because this is one of the most important features of complexity thinking, emergence. So it is one of the features of complexity thinking. It is one of the features of complexity theory. So emergence as a feature cannot be found or reduced to the properties of the parts which form that characteristic, according to Human, 2016. What emerges by virtue of any change made by you as a translator on purpose or by accident cannot be found inside the individual properties of the components, but it is a result of the interaction. Again, we try to highlight the word interaction. Interaction should be taken into consideration when we try to understand or analyze any narrative, any product. Emergence can help avoiding reductionist views on the concept of translation and interpreting. We have already mentioned that we said a narrative cannot be reduced to its elements by adopting a reductionist methodology. This is because the whole, according to the complexity thinking, according to the complexity theory, is more than just the sum of the parts. So here we look at translation process at its macro level, when we concentrate on the work achieved by all those people involved in the process of translation. So here, when we look at translation as a complex activity, we don't concentrate on the work achieved by the translator only, but rather we concentrate on the work achieved by all those people involved in the process of translation at its macro level, such as a translator, reviser, proofreader, editor, translation quality controller, and so on and so forth. So just let me read here. So here, according to this theory, complexity theory, we focus on the work achieved by all those people involved in the process of translation at its macro level, such as the translator, editor, reviser, editor, proofreader, translation quality controller, translation manager, etc. We focus on the interaction among them and how they organize themselves. And this is another feature of complexity thinking. This is another feature of complexity theory, which is called self-organization. When we have more than one person, when we have more than one element, and we try to concentrate on the way in which they organize themselves. So this is one of the features of the complexity thinking or complexity theory. Both the source text and the target text constitute the reality of translation. You cannot imagine a translation without the target text. You cannot imagine a translation without the source text. And there should be some sort of a relationship between the source text and the target text. And this is in line with Chesterton's relational norm, 1997. Because if we don't have any relationship between the source text and the target text, we are not talking about translation, but we are talking about something else, such as rewriting. Okay. Added to that, complexity thinking or complexity theory in translation studies subverts binary oppositions such as phoneization, domestication, overt, covert, semantic, communicative, formal, dynamic, reader-oriented, author-oriented, and so on and so forth. You cannot classify translations into two main types. Why? Because it is difficult, it is hard to confine yourself as a translator to one global strategy. But normally, when you translate a text, in particular, a lengthy text, you'll find yourself swinging between two main global strategies. As such, complexity thinking shifts the focus of attention from studying substance or stability to studying relationships, process, or change based on substance or the complex relations between them. This is according to Maris, 2015. As such, in our analysis, we should focus on the relationships and connections between parts and wholes, not just on parts. So let me share those questions with you. What will happen to the narrative? What will happen to the product? What will happen to the story if you change, as a translator, by accident or on purpose, the elements which are unique to a particular narrative? If you change the agent, if you hide the agent, if you change the place, what will happen to the narrative? What will happen to the narrative if you add an event by virtue of the first feature of narrativity, which is called selectivity? What will happen to the narrative if you delete an event? What will happen to the product, to the narrative, to the story if you reorder those events? If you place them okay, within a different plot. If you place those events selected by you as a translator within a different plot, if you charge them with different moral and ethical significance, if you add a process of doing, a process of having, a process of existing, a process of being, a process of saying, a process of sensing, and so on and so forth. What will happen to the narrative? What will happen to the project? What will happen to the product if you change a process from a process of having into a process of doing? If you change a process from a process of doing into a process of existing, and so on and so forth? What will happen to the narrative? What will happen to the product if you change a process into a circumstance, or the other way around, if you change a circumstance into a process? What will happen to the narrative if you don't pay attention to the characteristics of the matter, typically expressed by noun phrases? If you change, for example, the semantic rule assigned to that noun phrase? What will happen to the narrative if you don't pay attention to the characteristics or the grammatical categories of the action, typically expressed by a verb? If you change the tense, if you change the aspect, if you change the voice, what will happen to the narrative? What will happen to the narrative, to the story, to the project, if you don't pay attention to the language user's attitude? We need to be clear about the term attitude. I'm going to define that term later. If you change what is evaluative to non-evaluative, if you scale it up or down, and so on and so forth, we have a lot of questions. So will that affect the narrative? Will that affect the story, the project? Okay, so let's try to discuss all those questions in this lecture. But before answering those questions, we need to be clear about certain terms and issues such as narrative. So what is meant by a narrative? What is narrativity? Are they synonyms? Transitivity processes, attitude, appraisal, semantic rules, imaging systems. Let me start with narrative. A narrative can be defined following Somers and Gibson 1994 as a story, as a product, as a story of a set of events, ordered in sequence, both temporally and spatially. But narrativity is the process. For me, in this project that I've been working on, narrativity can be defined as a directionality that you superimpose on the text at hand, to have it meet your own accumulated value system, to have it meet your own sense of belonging, to have it meet your own assumptions, background, or just to have it meet your own linguistic competence, which is the most important part of your own translation competence. Processes, according to Halliday, are classified into 6 types. I classified them 2018 in my book, The Nuts and Bolts, into 8. Process of doing, I'm reading. Process of happening, the ball disappeared. Process of sensing, I feel happy. Process of saying, she said to me. Process of behaving, she smiled. Process of having, I have 3 kids. Process of being, I'm a teacher, and so on and so forth. Attitude. What is meant by an attitude? Actually, an attitude refers to the feeling or opinion that you have about something or about somebody. If you have it about something, then we have an example of appreciation, taqdir. But if you have it about somebody, then we have an example of judgment, hukm. For example, she is a good girl. So here we have an evaluative word, good. So by virtue of this word, by virtue of this adjective, by virtue of this evaluative word, we can figure out the language user's attitude towards the girl, which is an example of judgment. So what about if I ask you to remove the word good? We're going to have she is a girl. So we're going to change what is evaluative into non-evaluative. Therefore, it is difficult to figure out the language user's attitude without relying on the context, context, facial expressions, and so on and so forth. Appraisal. Actually, according to Martin and White, 2005, appraisal theory, appraisal is made up of three main elements. An attitude, we have already touched on that element, the most important one in the appraisal theory. Engagement, al-musharaka, when you refer to somebody by virtue of attribution, al-isnad, somebody said, qala, adafa, adda'a, and so on and so forth. And the third semantic system, according to the appraisal theory, is called graduation, at-tadrij. So what is the difference between she's a good girl and she's an excellent girl? And what is the difference between she's a good girl and she's a kind of girl? We scale up and down the language user's attitude towards the girl. Now, semantic rules or verb-specific semantic rules, those rules that should be reflected in our translation. Otherwise, if we change the semantic rules, we are going to change the meaning. So each noun phrase, syntactically speaking, okay, fills a semantic rule, semantically speaking. So in order to identify the semantic rules, you have to be able to identify the noun phrases. You should have some knowledge and syntax. We are going to discuss an example to make what I have in my mind clear. And the last item that I would like to share with you, the imaging systems from cognitive linguistics. Those ideas taken from my book with my colleague, Dr. Khalid al-Shihari of Qatar University, titled The Arabic English Translator as Photographer. So each and every person has 4 imaging systems: configurational system, attentional system, perspectival system, and force dynamic system. Now, let's have an example to make what I have in my mind clear. We have an example here, our perfect teacher. We have an evaluative word that should be reflected in the target text, that should be reflected in the target text if we try to produce an accurate translation, if we try to maintain the language user's attitude towards the teacher. It is an example of judgment because we have that opinion about somebody. So our perfect teacher, this is a noun phrase. We have the 3 words, determiner, adjective, and noun. As long as we have a noun phrase, we should have a semantic rule. And that semantic rule should be maintained in our translation. Otherwise, we are going to change the meaning. So our perfect teacher, participants, and each participant should have certain characteristics that should be given full consideration. Has kept traveling. We have a verb, so we have a process according to functional linguistics. So what is the type of this process? Actually, it is a process of doing. Syntactically speaking, grammatically speaking, here we have a finite verb. Why? Because you are able to identify the tense. What is the tense? The tense is a present. We are able to identify the aspect. What is the aspect? The aspect is a combination of both perfect and progressive. And also we are able to identify the voice and so on and so forth. Therefore, it is a finite verb in a finite clause. So we have an action. If you remember when we said each process is made up of 3 main components: participant, action, and circumstances. With his nice wife, again, we have an evaluative word, nice. If you remove the word nice, and then it is difficult to figure out the language user's attitude towards the wife. So this is circumstance, more accurately, company. That indicates a noun, that, includes a noun phrase. Why? Because with his wife altogether, this is what? A circumstance. But inside that circumstance, what we have his nice wife, determiner, adjective, and noun. Therefore, it is a noun phrase. As long as we have a noun phrase, we should have what? We should have a semantic rule, and so on. To London, another circumstance, place. To buy, another verb, another process of doing. But this time, we have a non-finite verb. Why? Because we are not able to identify the tense, aspect, and so on and so forth. It is a non-finite verb. To buy a small, again, small is an evaluative word that should be reflected, flat. So to buy a small flat altogether is a circumstance answering the question, why? So now, let me share these questions with you. How many processes are there? Actually, in order to identify the processes in any text, you have to be able to identify the main verbs. I'm talking about the main verbs, not auxiliaries. So how many verbs are there? Actually, we have two verbs, travel and buy. Therefore, we have two processes of doing. How many semantic rules can be identified? I've already mentioned that. In order to be able to identify the semantic rules, you have to be able to identify the noun phrases. How many noun phrases are there in order to be able to identify the semantic rules, and so on and so forth? Can you identify the language user's attitude towards the teacher? Is it positive or negative? Is it explicit or implicit? Can you identify the language user's attitude towards the wife? Is it positive or negative? Is it explicit or implicit? And can you identify the language user's attitude towards the flat? Is it positive or negative? Is it explicit or implicit, and so on and so forth? So this is how to analyze the text in order to understand. Can you identify the characteristics of the matter? Let's start, because we have more than one matter. Let's concentrate on our perfect teacher. Or better, let's concentrate on the action. Has kept traveling. So by virtue of this grammatical form, by virtue of this content specification, has kept traveling, by virtue of to keep, the act of traveling in the process of doing is drawn out over a long period of time. In addition to that, we don't talk about one act of traveling, but rather we talk about more than one act. So the process is characterized by multiplicity, to borrow terms from the imaging systems. When we talk about the quantity of the action, whether it is made up of one element or more than one element. And you normally travel and you come back. Therefore, the act of traveling, by virtue of this grammatical form, by virtue of this content specification, is characterized by having breaks and interruptions. When we talk about the state of dividedness, another category taken from the imaging systems. So all these details should be reflected in your translation in order to produce an accurate translation, in order to produce a similar mental image, in order to maintain the same story, the same narrative. Okay? And so on and so forth. Now, let's go back to narrative and narrativity. We said they are not synonyms. A narrative is a story. So it is a product. Can be translated into Arabic as hikayah. But narrativity is the process, is the directionality that you superimpose as a translator on the text at hand to have it meet your own accumulated value system, your own ideology, your own sense of belonging, your own assumptions, background, and so on and so forth. Or, no, sometimes to have it meet your own linguistic competence. which is part of your own translation competence. Therefore, narrativity can be translated into as-sard or aliyat as-sard. So narrativity in this project can be classified into two main types, and this is my own classification, my colleagues. Okay, narrativity by external framing and narrativity by internal framing. Let me start with the second type, narrativity by internal framing. It is something recommended when you take into consideration the differences between the interfacing languages, when you take into consideration the differences between the interfacing cultures, thus superimposing certain directionality on the text at hand, just to live up to the target language reader's expectations. You haven't changed the meaning. So therefore, we encourage people to take into consideration the differences between the interfacing languages. So this is called narrativity by internal framing. I'll repeat, it is something recommended. But narrativity by external framing, no. It could be on purpose or by accident. If it is on purpose, then you are motivated by your own ideology. You are motivated by your own accumulated value system. You are motivated by your own identity. You are motivated by your own sense of belonging. There's superimposing certain directionality on the text at hand to have it meet your own ideology or the ideology of the company that you are working for. But sometimes no, sometimes by accident, due to your own linguistic competence or translation competence. You have analyzed the text, and this is your own understanding. Therefore, you put it in that way, which is wrong. Again, you have superimposed certain directionality, certain narrativity on the text at hand, but by accident. Now, we have a text here, okay, taken from BBC. I will just analyze the first two paragraphs. Let me start with the first one. 4 of the 6 Palestinian inmates who escaped from a high security jail, the language user didn't say a jail, but he or she said a high security jail. Therefore, high security jail is an evaluative expression that should be reflected in our translation if we want to maintain the language user's attitude towards the jail. Earlier this week have been captured, passive, have been perfect. Who said that? According to the source text, Israeli police. Okay, we should have Israeli police say. Okay, yeah, Israeli police say. Now, how many processes are there? Actually, we need to identify the verbs. We need to identify the main verbs. How many verbs? How many main verbs? Actually, we have 3. We have escape, that invokes in our mind a frame, that invokes in our mind a fear, a frame. Capture, who captured them? Actually, the language user decided not to mention the agent. The language user decided not to mention the actor, backgrounded. And this is another category that can be taken from the imaging system, more accurately, the second imaging system, which is called attentional system. And again, the verb to capture invokes in our mind a powerfulness frame, indicating that the actor, the agent, is characterized by being able to do. It is characterized by being able to capture, while the affected participant is characterized by being able not to do, powerlessness or submission. So we have 2 processes of doing, in addition to a process of saying, expressed by the verb to say. As long as we have a process of saying, we have an example of attribution. It's not you refer to somebody, somebody said. Therefore, the text is heteroglossic, to borrow terms from Bachten. According to Bachten, text can be classified into 2 main types, heteroglossic when you, as a language user, decide to open up space for alternative voices to be heard. When you, as a language user, as a speaker, as a writer, decide to open up space for alternative sources to get involved. So we have more than one voice. But also we have another type of text, which is called monoglossic. When we have just one voice, when we have just your own voice. Why? Because you, as a language user, decide not to open up space for alternative voices to be heard. So here, as long as we have Israeli police, we have saya, al-qa'il, so we have attribution. And by virtue of the verb to say, which is a neutral, because there is no clear indication where the language user stands concerning the attributed material. So it is neutral. Therefore, according to the appraisal theory proposed by Martin and White 2005, it is an example of acknowledgement, إقرار محايد. قال is different from ادعى, because ادعى, if you opt for ادعى as a translation for somebody said, you are going to change the language user's attitude, because ادعى is an example of distancing, تنصل, when you distance yourself from the attributed material, which is also different from to explain or to make it clear, which is an example of endorsement, التعضيد. So you need to identify the type of the attribution and you maintain that. Otherwise, you're going to have an example of narrativity by external framing, either on purpose or by accident. Now, let's have a look at the translations of this part. We have the process of doing in the source text, just to remind you, we have the process of doing, followed by another process of doing, and then the process of saying. But in Arabic, the translators decided to start with the process of saying, having taken into consideration the differences between English and Arabic. صرحت الشرطة الإسرائيلية، قالت شرطة الكيان، أوضحت الشرطة الإسرائيلية، صرحت الشرطة الإسرائيلية، ذكرت شرطة الاحتلال، أعلنت الشرطة الإسرائيلية. So all of them started with the process of saying. So this is an example of narrativity by internal framing, something recommended, because they have taken into consideration the differences between English and Arabic. In English, yes, you have the right to start with the process of saying. Somebody said that, or sometimes no, you start with the saying followed by the verb and the saya, or the saya and the verb. You have three options at least. But in Arabic, no, we prefer to start with the verb. We start with the verb. We normally prefer to start with the process of saying, فعل القول. But one of the translators opted for أوضحت. Okay, الشرطة الإسرائيلية. The Israeli police made it clear. So the translator here has translated what is neutral, has translated the example of acknowledgement الإقرار المحايد into an example of endorsement, thus scaling up the language user's attitude towards the process of saying. This is an example of narrativity by external framing, but we are not sure whether it is on purpose or by accident, but I can guess it is by accident, and so on and so forth. Let's consider another example just to speed up. Let me move to the third one. The incident came after what Israeli media, let's concentrate on Israeli media. Okay, الإعلام الإسرائيلي أو وسائل الإعلام الإسرائيلية. But look at the third translation and the sixth translation, the two translators opted for Al-Kayan al-Sahyoni and Al-Kayan al-Sahyoni. It seems that they were motivated by their own ideology, their own sense of belonging, their own accumulated value system, thus superimposing certain directionality on the text at hand in order to have it meet their own ideologies. This is an example of narrativity by external framing on purpose. More examples. We have two examples here taken from a collection of short stories translated into English by Ronak Husni, my colleague, and also my colleague Daniel Newman, 2008. Let's start with the first example. قالت وهي ترمق سوارا ذهبيا في معصمها سأدفع لك ما تريد. Here we have four processes. A process of saying expressed by the verb قالت, a process of sensing expressed by the verb ترمق, a process of doing expressed by سأدفع, which is part of a reality because it is in the future, and the fourth one is a process of sensing according to holiday expressed by the verb to read. So in the source text we started with قالت, but the two translators, a native speaker of Arabic and a native speaker of English, decided to start with a process of sensing in an infinite clause, staring at, followed by she said, process of saying, I will pay you what you want. Have they changed the meaning? Actually, no. But they have taken into consideration the differences between the interfacing languages. Therefore, this is an example of narrativity by internal framing, which is recommended. But let's have a look at the second example. عاد من جديد يسترق النظر إليها عله يجد شيئا في ملامحها يضيء ما اعتراه من حيرة وذهول. عاد من جديد يسترق النظر. So by virtue of the grammatical form, by virtue of the content specification, we have a process of sensing. But that process, by virtue of that grammatical form, is drawn out over a short period of time. But unfortunately, the two translators opted for, once again, he glanced, thus reducing the act of glancing, thus reducing the process of sensing to be seen as a point on the timeline. This is an example of what? Of narrativity by external framing, but by accident. عله, let's concentrate on the particle عله. عاد من جديد يسترق النظر إليها عله يجد شيئا. By virtue of عله, it is not asserted, we are not sure, it is not asserted that he found something in her features. It is not asserted that he found something in her features. Therefore, it is part of a reality. But the two translators, unfortunately, opted for the additive connector and noticed, which is part of reality. It is asserted, we are sure that he found something in her features. Again, this is an example of narrativity by external framing, but by accident. And the last example that I would like to share with you, taken from the poet عدنان الصاغ, الشاعر العراقي عدنان الصاغ. أصعدني الحلاج إلى أعلى تل في بغداد وأراني. So here, what we have, it is part of reality by virtue of the additive connector وأراني. So the extent of causation is greater than the scope of intention. تحقق الفعل أكبر من مديات النية. But unfortunately, the two translators opted for to show. So Al-Hallaj lifted me to the highest hill in all Baghdad to show. So by virtue of this word, this grammatical form, this content specification, and the target text, the scope of intention is greater than the extent of causation. Therefore, the translation is not accurate. And these are the examples that I would like to share with you. And thanks for listening. And back to you, Dr. Mona and Dr. Lina. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, for such an enriching and enlightening talk, actually, which is, I just have one question. Are you still in the process of studying this theme of narrativity and narrative, or it's already published as a paper?
No, it is a project, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And we have already set out a 5-year research plan. We are going to publish a number of pieces of research, and at the end, within 5 years, we are going to publish that theory, which is called, for the moment, a complexity thinking theory of translation. So
Okay,
we try to present our ideas from time to time in order also to receive feedback from other colleagues and carry on working on that theory. Thank you.
Okay, and the translations you shared with us, were they from what, a corpus? The translations of the كيان الصهيوني, الاحتلال الإسرائيلي. These are students' translations or what?
Some of them students.
Okay.
Because it is just for the purpose of the presentation. But normally, no, we have to decide the data. Actually, we have found a number of novels translated by professional translators, and then submitted to the publisher, and then the publisher asked the translators, please, could you remove this and that? Therefore, that's why when we said the translation is a complex activity, and we are going to concentrate on all those involved in the process of translation, not only the translator, because sometimes this is my own translation, which is with the publisher, when send my own translation to a reviser, editor, or for any reason, ask me to remove that part, remove that word, thus changing the translation, either dramatically or slightly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ali. We have a question here from Mr. Ahmed Al Actually, they are a twofold question. The first one, can we say that dependency as a feature of narrative is similar in function to that of emergence as a feature of complex theory?
No, actually, thank you, Ahmed. Actually, Ahmed is one of my PhD students. He's working on at Hamad bin Khalid University. He's working at the narrative theory. But no, dependency is different from the emergence. Emergence is buzur or dhuhr, something that you cannot predict. I'm going to translate the text and I will send it to the publisher, and then all of a sudden the publisher might ask you, please, could you remove this or that, or could you do this and that? So something could happen. But dependency, no, it is something that the interpretation of one element. Let's talk about the events. The interpretation of that event relies on the interpretation of the other events, whether inside the story or outside the story. So that's why we call it dependency, because each event, which is part of the narrative, depends on the other event, and so on and so forth. This is the first question. So they are no synonyms. Thanks a lot, Ahmed.
Okay. Ahmed is asking again about the complex theory and narrativity. Do you think they have a lot in common? Do you agree to that?
Yes, I do agree. Why? Because this is what we started. We started with, actually, that theory, complexity thinking, we normally concentrate on the process rather than the product. But as long as we said the reality of translation is made up of the source text and the target text, we have to take into consideration the product. And if you remember what I said each narrative is made up of several events, and each event is made up of several processes, etc. But according to the complexity thinking theory, you cannot reduce the whole to the parts, but you have to take into consideration the interaction among parts, and also the relationship between parts and whole and parts. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, I'll take another advantage of me being the moderator. Okay. Since you're doing a lot of work with Julian Hauser, right?
Yeah, currently only two, but in the future we might carry on working because, to be honest, I enjoyed working with her. I've felt that also she enjoyed working with me. We have already finished the first project. We have already submitted to the publisher, and we are working on the second one. Something that I like, something that I enjoyed working on because linguistics, and I'm into linguistics, to be honest with you. Therefore, we have to submit the project within 2-3 months, but I might ask the publisher to give us another year. Why? Because in order to discover, in order to learn. Yeah. The idea of this book, Linguistics for Translators, emerged 4 or 5 years ago when I was asked to teach linguistics in Oman, and then I start working on that project. But when we submitted to Routledge and it was accepted, and also they suggested something, and then we started working seriously on this project. We have different examples from different languages. We rely on others. I'm a native speaker of Arabic, okay. She's a native speaker of another language. She has access to another language, but we need more languages. Therefore, from time to time, also I ask colleagues to help me in analyzing any sentence. We have finished till now more than, let's say, 70%. We can submit the whole project right now, but I told you, I've enjoyed working on this project, therefore it is better to sleep on it here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are you going in your book, Dr. Ali, with Julian, are you going to revisit the covert and overt translation approach, her models of quality translation, quality assessment, or it will not be addressed in this book?
Yeah, the whole idea, it could be, the whole idea is that we start each chapter. Let me just summarize. For example, the first chapter, morphology. We start with the same ideas taken from morphology as a branch of linguistics, as a branch of formal linguistics. So in the first part of the chapter is somehow similar to any course on linguistics. And then we move in the second part, which is titled Connecting Dots. So we try to link those ideas taken from that branch to the translation studies, translation theories, approaches, and so on and so forth. And then we move to the second chapter, let's say syntax, and then semantics, and so on and so forth, functional linguistics. Sometimes we feel that that branch is more important. Therefore, we might have more than one chapter. For example, functional linguistics, we might have more than one chapter. Semantics, we might have more than one chapter. But cognitive linguistics, we might go for just the imaging systems. Always we have that question in our mind. Is it important for the actual act of translating or no? And we move. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. We have a question here from Muhammad Arabi. He says, he's asked about what is the difference between the process of doing and the process of behaving?
Thank you, Muhammad. Muhammad is another PhD student at Khalifa University, and he's working on the translating of Quran. And yes, Muhammad, the process of, actually it is difficult to distinguish between them, but this is the classification proposed by Holiday. And the best way to distinguish between these two processes is that we have a limited number of verbs that can be used as examples of processes of behaving. The rest, processes of doing. So, for example, to smile. Actually, you are doing something when you smile. But according to that model, according to Holiday, it is a process of behaving. To cry, it is a process of behaving, although you are doing something. To watch TV, it is a process of what? of doing. You have the right as a writer to say, in this project, in this book, in this piece of research, I will treat them as one type to cut it short. Therefore, according to Holiday, we have 6 types, but according to me, 2018, we have 8. Why? Because I felt it is easier for people to have a process of having. For example, the book contains 10 chapters. The book contains 10 chapters. Here we have a process of having. This book belongs to me. This is a process of having. And what about the process of being? According to Holiday, these 2 processes is just one type. So sometimes as a writer, yes, you have the right to modify, but I do agree with you. It is difficult to figure out the differences between the process of doing and the process of behaving, unless you rely on the list of the verbs. Why? Because you have a limited number of verbs that can be used to express processes of behaving, around 20, 30, something like that. Thank you, Mohammed, for your good question.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Another question from one of our attendees. He or she is saying, I'm sorry for my question, but I wanted to know why most of the Arabic sentences are written by الجملة الفعلية.
This is our style. Not all of them. I think he or she said most. Yes, this is our style. We prefer to start the sentence with the verb. So, but we have sentences, in particular, sometimes you feel that, no, it is better to start your sentence with the noun, مبتدأ وخبر. So instead of saying ذهب الرجل, you can say الرجل ذهب, if you feel it is better. But this is our style. Why do they start with the subject? Why don't they have, let's say, more than one classification? So this is according to their own grammar, and this is according to our grammar. And also we have different styles, and they have different styles. Those styles should be taken into consideration by translators, by translation teachers, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Dr. Mona, in the chat box, there is a question by Dr. Fawzi Tayyib. What would you like to suggest for overcoming the difficulties that may face EFL Arab learners in translating English idiomatic expressions?
Idiomatic expressions, yeah. Actually, it is one of the most important areas that we have to. One year, I suggested that we should have a course titled, let's say, idiomatic expressions, or translating, if it is, let's say, translation department, and then you concentrate on those. So semantically speaking, we have 2 main principles: open choice principle, when you rely on the denotative meaning of each word in order to figure out the meaning of that part, of that big part, that sentence, whatever. But sometimes you fail. You cannot rely on the denotative meaning of those elements in order to figure out the meaning of that big part. Therefore, you have to activate what is called idiom principle. But the problem with that principle, you have to do your best. You have to read. You have to memorize. Sometimes as a teacher, sometimes as a writer, sometimes as a native speaker, you come across an idiom that you are not familiar with. So this is normal. But the more you try, the better. So I suggested, and I do believe in that, we should have, in particular when we teach BA students, we should have a course, a course in our program to concentrate on the idioms or culture-specific terms, or a combination. Thanks a lot, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. I think
just to add, I mean, as an idiom, you should treat that idiom as one unit. You should treat that idiom, if it is made up of 3 words, you have to, from the beginning, you have to treat these 3 words as one unit. It is a piece of cake, a piece of cake. one, it means easy, and you start using it when you communicate. That's it, part of your own language. Move on. Thank you.
Okay, I think we don't have any more questions. Thank you, Dr. Ali, for such an enriching and enlightening talk. And we hope to have you with us in, inshallah, upcoming events at PSU.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.